Hi, this is Professor Chakraborty. This is the lecture on brain and behavior. Today we will be learning how brain and particularly hypothalamus controls the hormones that are associated with behavior. So we have learned about hypothalamus and its importance when we learned about brain. Today we are going to review those functions and then we are going to expand our knowledge as to how hypothalamus controls the release of several hormones from the endocrine system or endocrine glands in order to have an effect on different target organs to control behavior. So, um, hypothalamus, if you remember, is part of the diencephalon, and it is just below the thalamus. And the functions of thalamus and hypothalamus is very, very different. There are several different activities physiologically hypothalamus can control many functions, among which the major one is the endocrine function, which controls the activity of different neurons in the is controlled by the different neurons in the hypothalamus. Likewise, there is temperature regulation is governed by alteration of different regions of the hypothalamus. There is control of water balance, drinking, feeding, and sexual behavior are some of the several functions of hypothalamus, which I'm going to go over one by one before I start. So just to overview how the hypothalamus looks like. So if you see in here, this is the region where it's the thalamus, and this is the hypothalamus. So you can see there are different, groups of nuclei that enclosed within the hypothalamus, and they have different names, and you can see pretty much if these are colored, you would feel like they are like Skittles, but each of these unit of group of cell, which is known as nucleus, so a group of cell doing a particular function is called a nucleus in the brain or the nervous system. And you can see there are several such nucleus in the hypothalamus, like paraventricular nucleus, preoptic area, anterior hypothalamic nucleus, suprachiasmatic nucleus, and so on and so forth. And each of these units or nucleus, as you can see, is related with a particular function. Okay, so these groups functioned together, and each of the other groups that you look in here have different functions. The hypothalamus actually is connected to the pituitary. Pituitary, which is a master gland, is connected with the pituitary through a stalk-like structure which is known as infundibulum. Okay, so infundibulum, so the hypothalamus is connected to the pituitary through the infundibulum, and the hypothalamus pretty much controls the pituitary, and hence hypothalamus is considered to be a neuroendocrine gland or organ. So why neuroendocrine? Neuro because it's part of the nervous system, endocrine because it helps in the production of the hormones, and it itself produces several hormones too. So it has a nervous system function, and it has an endocrine system functions. As such, it is known as a neuroendocrine gland. So going forward, so before we jump into how hypothalamus controls, let's review a little bit about the functions of the hypothalamus. Number one, it is a master control of autonomic nervous system. We have not learned autonomic nervous system yet, but just a little bit of preview is that hypothalamus is one of the major integration center. It actually helps in controlling several autonomic physiological functions in our body like heart rate, blood pressure, digestive activities, and respiration, which is all part of the autonomic nervous system. Number two, it is a master control of endocrine system. Why? Because hypothalamus secretes hormones and it also controls the secretion of hormones from the pituitary. There are several hormones which are produced by the hypothalamus, like oxytocin and antidiuretic hormones. These are produced in the hypothalamus and stored in the pituitary. So it produces. In addition, we'll learn how it helps in the production of other hormones from the pituitary. The third, regulation of body temperature. The body's thermostat is located within the hypothalamus, right? Neurons in the hypothalamic area detect altered blood temperature and signal other hypothalamic nuclei, which control the mechanism of heat or cool in your body. So if you are in a beach where the temperature is 100 degrees, or you are in a region where it's snowing, the temperature is very, very different in the environment. How does your internal body physiology combat that? This the thermostat, which is called the hypothalamus of your body, it does the task. It regulates the temperature, the internal temperature of your body, so that the normal physiology or the homeostasis of your body continues. The fourth is control of emotional behavior. The hypothalamus is located around the center of the limbic system, which is part of the brain that controls emotional responses like pleasure, aggression, fear, rage, contentment, and sex drive. All of these are very important, and these are part of the emotional behavior, which is also controlled by the hypothalamus. Next. Fifth is control of food intake. So neurons in the hypothalamus monitor the levels of nutrients such as glucose, amino acids in the blood, and produce sensation of hunger. And we have the satiety center around in the hypothalamus. It can control food. We have several nuclei which are responsible to inhibit food intake or to increase food intake. So hunger is controlled in the hypothalamus. Control of water intake, which is the sixth point. Specific neurons within the hypothalamus continuously monitor the concentration of substances in the blood to regulate the sensation of thirst. So how much water will be taken in is regulated by hypothalamus. And remember, it also produces a hormone which is known as antidiuretic hormone, which helps in the regulation of food intake. Regulation of sleep-wake cycle. Seventh point, that is the circadian rhythm. The suprachiasmatic nucleus, which you can see it in here. This suprachiasmatic nucleus is responsible or directs the pineal gland to secrete melatonin at certain times of the day. So it is there which helps to direct the pineal gland for production of melatonin. So during the, what is the sleep-wake cycle? What is the circadian rhythm? Example is, for example, if you wake up at 7 a.m. in the morning, and even if the doors and the windows are all closed, it's dark inside your room, every morning at 7 a.m. you will get up, you will wake up from your sleep. The reason being, it is the biological clock. So that's the clock which is maintained by the hypothalamus. This biological clock, or circadian rhythm, is controlled by melatonin. And that's the reason if you travel across the continent, for example, I traveled to India, and it's 10 hours of time difference, which is known as the lag time, or, so my biological clock gets completely destroyed. So that means, so at night I feel to be awakened, and during the day I feel like sleeping. So this is the biological clock which is controlled by melatonin. There are you can take melatonin tablets which are available over the counter in order to set back the circadian rhythm, but this biological clock is controlled by the hypothalamus. So with this, we go ahead to learn how these various functions of the hypothalamus, and specifically the endocrine function of hypothalamus is controlled, okay, how it controls it. And it primarily, the endocrine function, it controls with the help of pituitary. So if you look in here, this is the hypothalamus, and it has its control on the pituitary. We'll learn a little bit of pituitary also. So just, I'll come back to this slide again. So just to understand the pituitary. So this is the hypothalamus and this is the pituitary. The hypothalamus is connected to the pituitary by this stalk-like structure which is known as infundibulum. The pituitary in turn has two regions. One is known as the anterior lobe, or also known as adenohypophysis, and the other is known as the posterior lobe or neurohypophysis. Remember, anterior lobe, adenohypophysis, and posterior lobe, neurohypophysis. And there is a significance for that. The hypothalamus actually produces certain hormones, which in turn controls the release of certain hormones from the anterior pituitary. But the hypothalamus produces some hormones and stores them in the posterior pituitary. So it's two different things. One is hypothalamus producing some hormones and controlling, and those hormones in turn controlling the release of certain hormones from the anterior pituitary. On the other hand, the posterior pituitary hormones are produced in the hypothalamus and stored in the posterior pituitary. So hypothalamus has a control, complete control on the pituitary. The hormones that are released from the hypothalamus is known as the regulatory hormones, because they regulate the release of hormones from the anterior pituitary of the pituitary. Okay. So going back to what we were learning. So here you can see this is hypothalamus and this is the infundibulum, and this is the anterior pituitary, also known as adenohypophysis. This is a posterior pituitary, also known as neurohypophysis. So there are regulatory hormones. As you can see, these regulatory hormones are released from the hypothalamus, which in turn pass through with the blood. How? The blood supply or the blood transport from the hypothalamus to the pituitary is unique, which we will learn. It passes from here and goes into the anterior pituitary. In the anterior pituitary, there are cells or endocrine cells, which in turn produces some other hormones, which in turn acts on several other glands in the body to produce a third hormone. Okay, so it's a three-tier process from hypothalamus to anterior pituitary to the different target cells. The posterior pituitary, on the other hand, works different way. The neurons of the hypothalamus actually, there are hormones produced in the hypothalamus, which are transmuted, and here in the posterior pituitary, they remain stored. There are two hormones. One is called oxytocin, and the other is known as antidiuretic hormone. These two are produced in the hypothalamus, and they are transported through the neurons and stored in the posterior pituitary. The last of all is a direct neural control on the endocrine cells, which the example is only medulla oblongata. I'm very sorry, adrenal medulla. The adrenal medulla, which is, you can see it in here, adrenal medulla. This is an adrenal medulla is a gland which sits on top of the kidney. It's known as a suprarenal gland. It has two regions. One is the outermost region, which is known as cortex, and the innermost region, which is known as medulla. So the neurons from the hypothalamus have a direct control on the adrenal gland in the secretion of two major hormones, which is known as epinephrine and norepinephrine, which is related with fight and flight response in your body. And we will learn more about these when we learn about the autonomic nervous system, which is the next section. So what are the different kinds of neurons that are present in the hypothalamus? There are three different kinds of neurons that are present. Number one, I'm going from, I'm shifting from one to the other. The only reason is it will help you to understand. The number one is parvicellular hypophysiotropic neuron, which has, these neurons have, produces hormones, and these hormones act on the anterior pituitary to produce all these tropic hormones. So it is called hypophysiotropic neuron, this tropic, and so these produces these tropic hormones from the anterior pituitary. Next is a magnocellular neuron. These neurons produce hormones in the hypothalamus, and then they store them on the posterior pituitary, and as and when needed, they are released. The third is the projection neuron. It's known as hypothalamic projection neuron. They are, they basically have their control on the neuronal targets which are present in the adrenal medulla. So three different kinds of neurons control the release of hormones from the different parts of the pituitary or from the adrenal gland. Number one is parvicellular hypophysiotropic neuron, which control the production of tropic hormones. Number two, magnocellular neuron, which produces hormones in the hypothalamus and which are stored in the posterior pituitary. And the third is hypothalamic projection neuron, which have a complete control on the neurons of the adrenal medulla. So we did this before. Just a review: hypothalamus, this is pituitary, anterior pituitary, posterior pituitary. And just so that I just want to mention, there is an intermediate pituitary also, which is not very well developed in humans. Okay. The pathway in which the blood circulates in order to control the hormones to be released from the anterior pituitary. First and foremost, you should remember some of the things that I am mentioning here. Is at the median eminence, which you can see it in here, this region, a swelling of attachment happens near the infundibulum. The hypothalamic neurons release the hormones in this region of the median eminence near the infundibulum. The secretions enter the bloodstream. The hormones enter into this bloodstream very easily because the blood capillaries in this region is fenestrated. What is fenestrated? Fenestrated means a window. You might have heard this term before. Fenestrated capillaries means there are these are capillaries which allow relatively large molecules to enter and leave the bloodstream. So as a result, since these capillaries are fenestrated, hormones that are produced can go into these capillaries. And then from this capillary bed, that goes to the anterior pituitary. Okay, so this system through which these capillary bed are connected to each other is known as a hypophyseal portal system. Very, very unique portal system. We have one other in the kidney. These are the two, and so this is one of the most important points to remember here. So this arrangement or vascular system of blood entering the portal system to reach the intended target cells is called the hypophyseal portal system, and I'm going to explain that. The vascular arrangement is very unusual because it carries blood from one capillary network to the other. So you can see this is one capillary network, and it is connected to the next capillary network. In general, what happens in general in rest of the part of the body, a typical artery conducts blood from the heart to the capillary network, and a typical vein carries blood from the capillary network back to the heart. So it's a loop. From arteries carry it from the heart to different parts, and veins carry it back to the heart. Blood vessels that link two capillary networks. In this case, you can see this is one capillary network, this is another capillary network. Since they are connected, these two capillary networks are connected, they are known as portal vessels. In this case, they are veins. They can also be called as portal veins. The entire complex is a portal system. The entire thing, these entire thing coming from the superior hypophyseal artery, getting then dividing into a capillary bed, and then passing into the next capillary bed. The entire thing can be called a portal system, and this network is known as a hypophyseal portal system. So what is the significance of this portal system is there is efficiency in the transmitting of these chemicals. That means, so the hypothalamic hormones that are produced in this portal system has a direct control on the endocrine system of the endocrine cells of the anterior pituitary. As such, instead of getting diluted into the main blood system, it has a direct control, and that direct control helps in the production or release of the hormones from the endocrine system, endocrine cells of the anterior pituitary. Okay, so this is the hypophyseal portal system. Okay, so let's do it once more. So what is hypophyseal portal system? It is a system by which blood enters, like for example in here, with the help of superior hypophyseal artery, it comes to the median eminence or near the infundibulum. There is a network of blood capillaries formed. These network of capillaries are fenestrated, means they have holes in them. They allow large molecules or hormones to get into the system, and they pass from one system to the next system into the anterior pituitary, where they form another bed or capillary bed. They travel, they actually exchange. So these hypothalamic regulatory hormones come out and act on these endocrine cells of the anterior hypothalamic anterior pituitary cells, and as such there is release of next set of hormones from the anterior pituitary. So how does this work? If you know, or if you've taken a class on physiology, I'm pretty sure all of you know what is a feedback control is. So from the what you're learning here is from the hypothalamus, there is releasing hormones. These releasing hormones act on the pituitary. Here we're talking about anterior pituitary, and which in turn acts on different other target organs and glands. So in this case, the pituitary is releasing several hormones that, for example, adrenocorticotropic hormone, which acts on the adrenal cortex. If you remember, we were just talking about adrenal gland. It has an outer part and has an inner part. The outer cells are known as our adrenal cortex. Adrenal medulla is the inner part. Here, adrenal cortex, ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone, acts on the adrenal cortex, that the outer cells, which in turn produces cortisol. So this is a very, very important hormone which controls stress in our body. And apart from that, it has several other functions also, but we will do that. It's the endocrine functions is not that we will be dealing in details in this lecture. Then, and apart from that, it also produces two other hormones. One is called FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, LH, luteinizing hormone. Both of them are required by the gonads, or gonads require these hormones to produce estradiol or progesterone from the ovaries and testosterone from the testes. So the influence of these hormones on these gonads is absolutely a must in order for it to produce the next set of hormones for it to work on the target tissues. Then TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone produced by thyroid gland, and which in turn helps in the production of thyroxine, which is T3, T4, and calcitonin from the thyroid gland. So what we see in here is these are three levels of hormones that are produced. One, it is produced from hypothalamus, then from the pituitary, and then these target organs produce these target hormones. These can control the release of these hormones at the different levels. Number one, if the levels, for example, if the levels of thyroxine produced by thyroid gland increases, it can actually act negatively, telling the hypothalamus, stop, I don't need any more. As such, the release of these signals will cause hypothalamus not to releasing hormones, which is known as TRH, thyroid releasing hormone, not to release them. As such, it will act on the anterior pituitary, which will cause no release or less release of TSH. As such, thyroxine will reduce. So it's a negative feedback, works continuously as and when required. Okay, so this is a three-tier system of the production of hormones or control of the hormones by the hypothalamus. So just showing you another same thing that we learned. If the control is between pituitary and hypothalamus, it's known as a short loop. If it is between, it can also, the tissues itself can inhibit its own production. So that in that case, it's known as a auto inhibition. But if the inhibition is from the target tissue to the higher center, usually it's known as a long loop feedback. So the pituitary actually produces 7 to 9 different hormones. We'll understand each one of them. So if you see the pituitary, this is anterior pituitary, this is the posterior pituitary. So it produces growth hormone, somatotropin hormone. Number 2, adenocorticotropin hormone is ACTH. Then it produces thyroid stimulating hormone. Then it produces gonadotropic hormones, FSH and LH. It produces prolactin, lactogen producing hormones. And in the posterior pituitary, it's antidiuretic hormone, ADH. Oxytocin is also produced. In addition to that, there are another hormone which is known as MSH is also produced by the intermediate pituitary, which is not what we will be discussing in this lecture. So we are more interested to know how the hypothalamus controls this. As such, you see the hormones produced by the hypothalamus are known as the regulatory hormones. So for example, TRH is thyroid regulatory hormone, CRH is corticotropin regulatory hormone, GnRH is gonadotropin releasing hormone. So these releasing hormones actually produced by the hypothalamus act on the anterior pituitary. When they act on the anterior pituitary, they in turn produce these different types of hormones, which in turn acts on the endocrine target cells, which in turn produces the third, or you can say, if you call this first hormone, then this is the second hormone. If you call this first hormone, so this is the third hormone. Let's understand one, at least let's do GnRH. Gonadotropin releasing hormone produces follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, which acts on the testes and ovaries to produce testosterone, progesterone, and estrogen from the different gonads in our body. Now, once these are released, once its function is done, it can actually have a negative feedback and stop the production of those subsequent. It can stop at the level of regulatory hormones from the hypothalamus. It can stop at the level of anterior pituitary, or it can stop the production from the endocrine system. Now, some of the hormones production is not similar in the way we have just learned. For example, in the production of prolactin. Now, prolactin inhibitory factor and prolactin releasing factor, both are present. These neurons produce them. They act on the anterior pituitary to produce prolactin. Now, this prolactin in turn, like we had learned in the last slide, does not act in a organ to produce or gland to produce another hormone. In turn, this prolactin acts on the mammary gland to produce milk. Okay, so production of prolactin is in a little bit different manner than we had just studied earlier. Same thing for growth hormones. Growth hormone inhibitory factor are there. Growth hormone releasing factors are there, which act on anterior pituitary to produce growth hormones, which act on liver to produce, have its action on skeletal muscles, cartilages, other tissues. So in turn here, the liver is not producing another hormone in turn, but it is acting on the target to do the action of the physiology. And it definitely is also under the negative feedback loop. So this actually basically ends on the neuroendocrine control of hypothalamus. Just to review the entire thing, I would like to mention that that hypothalamus is a regulatory gland. It is called a neuroendocrine gland because it has its control on the release of hormone from the pituitary. It itself acts as an endocrine gland because it produces certain hormones. And definitely hypothalamus has a direct control on the pituitary. The pituitary is considered to be the master gland and it produces many hormones. So the regulation of hypothalamus is at 3 levels. Number 1, it produces regulatory hormones, which has its action on the anterior pituitary. It produces some hormones which are produced and are stored in the posterior pituitary. And then it has a direct control on adrenal medulla to produce certain hormones. There are 3 different kinds of neurons that do the task. And the effect or the hormones that are released by the hypothalamus has a direct control on the anterior pituitary because it works through a very sophisticated, I would say, system which is known as a hypophyseal portal system. And the hormones that are released from the hypothalamus, pituitary, and to the target hormones are pretty much under the negative feedback loop. So the physiology works in this way that whenever it is required, it is released, and whenever the physiological action is completed and the hormones are not required anymore, it can signal the higher brain centers, which is hypothalamus, to stop the production of the releasing hormones. Once the releasing hormones are stopped, the entire cycle stops. Pituitary is considered the master gland, and we know that it has several functions. There are 2 ways the endocrine secretion is controlled. One is the releasing hormones from the hypothalamus has its action on the anterior pituitary to produce some hormones, which acts on the target gland to produce certain other hormones. For example, thyroid releasing hormones from the hypothalamus has its action on the thyroid gland to produce TSH. The thyroid releasing hormone has its action on anterior pituitary to produce TSH, which is thyroid stimulating hormone, which in turn acts on the thyroid gland to produce thyroid hormone, which is T3, T4, and calcitonin. There is another way the regulation takes place. Regulation of prolactin is unique in the production of the anterior pituitary. In this case, the hypothalamus produces both the releasing hormone, TRH, and the inhibiting hormone, PIH. When one is stimulated, the other is inhibited. Same thing in case of growth hormone. The regulation of growth hormone production by the anterior lobe. When GHRH, which is growth hormone releasing hormone, is released, there is production of growth hormone. When GHIH is produced, which is growth hormone inhibiting hormone, is produced, the growth hormone production is reduced. So this actually, this lecture helps us to understand the neuroendocrine function of hypothalamus. We will, in the subsequent lecture, learn about how hypothalamus acts at the autonomic level, what are the autonomic functions of hypothalamus. So we will go over the autonomic nervous system in the next lecture.